In our last lesson, we began a discussion about the myriad programs brought to us by the New Deal, all those alphabet soup agencies that came into existence under the Roosevelt administration. Well, I'd like us to consider now the Works Progress Administration, one of the most significant and biggest programs to come out of that particular era. They saw their job as solving this problem that was the result of the Depression. What are we going to do with all of these unemployed men? And in very simple terms, they thought, well, why don't we put them to work? We'll give them some manual labor. We'll have them build things. And out of that came this mammoth agency with 8 million employees, in a manner of speaking. Well, let's ask a couple questions about this program. First, who benefits from it? Obviously, those construction companies that win the opportunity to have these men work for them and to secure the bids for these building programs, they win. The men who were otherwise unemployed but now have work to do, they win. And the politicians who get to divvy all of this out and likely secure votes for doing so, they win also. Well, who makes these decisions? Again, this is not a market-driven decision. These decisions are now being made by bureaucrats, by political appointees. Well, who loses in this situation? Well, if your construction company doesn't get the bid, you're going to lose out. If you're an opposing politician and you don't have the ability to hand out these kinds of gifts, you're going to lose out too. But ultimately, it's the nation who's going to pay because we're building and acquiring and constructing programs and processes and buildings and bridges that the market doesn't call for. This really creates 3 major problems. First, it creates a mindset, a perspective, whereby now the government is responsible for the individual's welfare. From the perspective of these employed people, those people who were unemployed, who now come to work, that 8 million strong number of people, now we construct for them a form of welfarism. But those companies who win these bids and who benefit, they're getting essentially the same kind of treatment. We have the creation of what we might call corporatism. And these two things together create our third problem. You see, now in the human mind, how much wealth we acquire is no longer dependent upon how productive we are, what good stewards we are, what kind of work we do. Now it's determined politically. Today we're going to look at how a nation gets and spends its money. Now we want to remember that government is created by God. It serves a purpose. It should have the money it needs to fulfill its God-given calling of protecting life and property, of wielding the sword. But what we're seeing in the 20th century is a growing perspective that suggests that the nation's wealth is there to be redistributed by the state for the state's purposes, in welfarism and in corporatism. Well, what does that do to a nation? Well, how do we pay for that? And what does it mean to our calling to be stewards over God's creation? Well, the New Deal was the coming out party, the official start of the welfare state. It took the perspective that the government can and should provide for the material and intellectual well-being of its people by controlling and directing the economy. Prior to this point, governments tended to only step forward to take more control, more central control in the context of war. But now in the context of peace, the central government is trying to control the economy. Well, what do we mean by well-being when we say the government is going to pursue the well-being, the material and intellectual well-being of its citizens? Well, the government, with the advent of the New Deal, is now beginning to provide poverty relief, old age pensions, health care, education, housing, unemployment benefits, subsidies, and so forth. This seems normal to us, but historically, this was a new concept. In fact, it was a radical departure from the mindset that guided our country from its founding, at least until the middle of the 19th century. They understood that the primary goal of government was to protect life and property, and that it was up to individuals to move from there. In fact, when our Constitution was written, it was written with the express purpose of limiting the size and scope of government, of keeping it out of our lives, except where it had its God-given calling. This is also a departure from the biblical view. The Bible affirms that it's the church, that it's the individual that has the responsibility to provide charity. The Bible links together work and income and sees that connection as a good thing. In fact, the Bible sees vocational work, a man's calling, as central to his meaning as a person. Perhaps even more importantly, the Bible connects charity with the gospel message. When we are in hardship because of our sin, without that gospel message, without the call to repentance, what we become is the prodigal son preservation society. We leave them in their trouble because we don't allow them to come to repentance. Now we understand this too in the biblical perspective because it's individual, because it's personal, because it's relational. There's a closer connection between the giving of the gift, giving of the help, and the call to personal responsibility. When my rescue comes from a bureaucrat multiple states away and it's mailed in a check, that's a very different relationship than you have, say, between Boaz and Ruth, where there's a relationship there. Finally, the Bible tells us this through the Apostle Paul. If a man doesn't work, neither let him eat. This is serious responsibility connected to the giving of charity. This historical view and the biblical view have been replaced in our day with the welfarist mentality that again suggests that it's the responsibility of the state to provide the individual with what we need economically, materially, and intellectually. Now that didn't come in a vacuum. That perspective arose ironically after a period of great prosperity brought on by a free economy. But it denies the very principles that got us the prosperity in the first place. It denies some very basic economic principles. Instead, for instance, it says that we've solved the problem of scarcity. We have all that we need. The only problem we have is a distribution problem. How are we going to divide things up? Well, what happens if we think we've solved the production problem? We end up not producing more. When we're focused on distribution, we miss the opportunity to produce more. This perspective doesn't see the link between work and production and the creation of wealth. Instead, it sees wealth as something that just happens, that's just out there, like a universe created by a big bang all by itself. And therefore it says what exists has to be evenly distributed. And because it doesn't grow the pie, we end up having to slice the pie into smaller and smaller pieces. This perspective ultimately believes that the government has the right to control every individual's private property and to choose what to do with it, what it wants, to pursue its welfarist ends. Which means at the end of the day, it's a socialist philosophy that undergirds the welfarist economic mindset. Let's consider some basic economic issues related to welfarism as a form of interventionism in the economy. First, remember that government can't produce anything. It can only redistribute, redirect, control, or constrain. And what that means is that it can only get its money from other people, those who are producing. Also remember this, that these kinds of interventions create the kind of errors in economic calculations that you might expect. As the government takes more and more money from those who are productive, it ends up controlling more and more of the whole of the economy, which gives us less information by which to make decisions. In fact, worse still, we end up taking money out of the realm of the productive, or money working to create more wealth, and it ends up becoming money that's consumed. Well, how much money are we talking about here? Well, consider this. From 1934, the year the Social Security Act was passed, until 2008, government spending, not private spending, government spending on pensions, welfare, and health care amounted to $45 trillion. That's a lot of money. This creates enormous, constantly increasing groups of people who are either partially or totally dependent, not on their own work, not on their own stewardship, not on their own calling, but they're dependent upon the state to provide for them. That's harmful for them and harmful for society. Government programs, understand, that are purportedly designed to help alleviate poverty actually end up creating more poverty. That's a basic economic principle. What you subsidize, you get more of. So let's look at some of the unintended consequences that come from some of these programs. Take a look at these charts that show us, for instance, first, the growth of the numbers of those on welfare since the radical increase in welfare programs with the Great Society in the 60s. We've got another chart that shows at the same time, and this hits even closer to home, that much less abstract, the growth of the number of unwed mothers and the breakdown of families on welfare. Finally, the third chart shows us the growth of the whole of the welfare class. Understand that this growth creates an ever-increasing load on those members of society who are producing. Now, Christians are supposed to have a concern for the poor. And it might seem like what we're saying is pushing against that. But the reality is we're not. Do Christians have a concern for the poor? Isn't it right for us to help people no matter what the source is? See, that's the problem. God has called us to help people, but He's established those sources by which people will actually be helped. And the state's not one of them. We want to help people, which is why God calls individuals and calls the church to do this, and doesn't call the state to do it. But you might be wondering, now wait a minute, all these people, all this money we're spending at the state level to care for people, surely you're not saying the church can pick up that entire burden. We just don't have the resources for that. Well, that's right. We've gotten into this mess over a long period of time, and it's going to take a long period of time to get out of this mess. But do understand this, as we begin to push back against the welfare perspective, we're going to see those who are able suddenly entering into productivity, entering into freedom, entering into no longer being dependent. Those who simply cannot do that, then we would have the resources to care for them. Remember this, government-sponsored welfare is not just bad for the economy in an abstract, grand way, though it is. It's not just bad in that it's taking money from productive people and giving it to others, though that's bad. The real horror of the government welfare system is that it's bad for those who receive it, those who are dependent on it. You don't have to trust me. Visit the poorer sections of town. Visit government housing, and you will see there second and third generations, people born into dependency upon the state, who will live their whole lives in dependency on the state, and who will raise children who are dependent upon the state. That's just wrong. We've talked about how welfarism is one form of the growth of the spending program of the government in our day. But there's another form also that we mentioned, corporatism. Here what happens is particular industries, particular businesses, particular special interests turn not to the market to help grow their business, but turn to the state. Now they can do this in one of two ways. If they're not able to raise actual money that they need for investment in the marketplace, they can go to the state to get that kind of money to help them survive a difficult time or to create investment capital. Another way that they can do this is to use the state to regulate away their competition, to use the legal process to give them an unfair advantage in the marketplace. Well, which industries do you suppose would be most given toward corporatism? Well, as you might suspect, if we were to look at the cabinet level agencies of the federal government, we're going to see an enormous amount of overlap. We're going to see corporatism in transportation. We're going to see it in energy. We're going to see it in education. We're going to see it in labor. We're going to see it in defense. And of course, we're going to see it in banking as well. The result is that political systems end up being about electing people or influencing people who have the ability and the authority to give me or my cronies a bigger slice of the pie, a bigger share of a given market. Now these are the basic problems with corporatism, economically speaking. First, again, the bureaucrat or the politician replaces the entrepreneur as the one making fundamental economic decisions on the allocation of resources. And they're forced to do it without the benefit of prices and profits and losses as an information giver by which to make these decisions. The results end up being that who gets the money is determined not by which company is productive, not by which company is meeting demand, but by which company is better connected politically. This means that it allows for less productive companies that aren't meeting market demand, to actually survive and sometimes thrive at the expense of their very own competitors, who, because they are meeting demand, they are profiting, and they're the ones that are paying the taxes that are being used to subsidize their competitors. We've all seen this going on in banking, in auto industry, in the airline industry. We're watching it before our very eyes. Secondly, remember that this spending also represents ultimately losses in productivity in the broader economy because of misallocated wealth, because of bankruptcy, because of the disincentives to produce when your wealth is being taken from you by the state. That the government is taking more than a third of our wealth and reallocating it each year is not a good sign for our liberty. It's not a good sign for free markets. How does the government end up getting all this money? Ultimately, there are really only two ways. They can either tax their way to getting this money or borrow their way to getting this money. First, let's get a brief history of taxation in America. During that colonial and early republic history, we had very few forms of taxation. In fact, we had a series of rebellions against the imposition of taxation at various parts in our early history. And those taxes were used to support a government that did its God-given calling to support life and property. These were typically excise taxes or property taxes. In the 20th century, as the government began its forays into welfarism and corporatism, it constructed all new systems of taxation, not only taking higher percentages, but finding new arenas in which to tax people. Now we have income taxes, estate taxes, corporate taxes, investment taxes, property taxes, excise taxes. Where I live, we even have an intangible tax, which seems to suggest that we don't know what we're taxing, we just want more of your money. Now, friends, the income tax itself was unconstitutional up until the passage of the 16th Amendment. Worse still, when it was passed, and to this day, it was constructed as a progressive tax. That is, the more a person earns, not only do they pay more taxes because they have the same percentage, they pay more taxes because they pay a higher percentage. That's not sound economics, and it's not sound biblically. This principle, this progressive taxation, violates biblical principles of equality and fairness. It treats one person different from another based on how much wealth they produce, which is ultimately another violation of the 8th commandment. It's a form of theft. It also encourages those with more money to try and influence the political system in order to create those loopholes by which they might be able to escape this kind of taxation. Remember, at the end of the day, the government, in its various forms, is taxing more than a third of the wealth of the American people each and every year. So what does this look like? We've looked at government spending. Let's take a look at the shift over the last 100 years of government income. Again, beginning in 1910, the government received in tax revenues $41 billion. That represented 8% of the gross domestic product of the nation in that year. By 1930, the government was now taxing 15% at a level of $131 billion. Growing again through the same process, 22% of the nation's wealth was taxed in 1950, representing $455 billion. In 1970, that percentage had crept up to 31%, or $1.3 trillion. By 1990, we had gotten to that marker of 33%, $2.7 trillion being taxed by governments at various levels. And finally, in 2008, still at 33%, we're at $4.3 trillion in taxation at all levels of government every year. Again, don't lose sight. The government is taxing 1/3 of the wealth of the American citizens every year. If you were watching carefully, you might have noticed an interesting phenomenon. As we looked at the growth of our spending and we looked at the growth of our taxing, there ended up being a gap between how much we were spending and how much we were taxing. Well, what does a government do when it can't or won't tax enough money to cover what it's spending? The only option left is to borrow the money. Now, that's a very dangerous business for anybody, particularly for a government, because the government doesn't have the ability to go out and produce more to cover their borrowing today. Because remember, governments don't produce. They only constrict, direct, and consume. So when the government borrows, what it's actually doing is promising to tax more in the future. Now, the biblical principle of what happens when we get into debt is very clear. When we get into debt, it's like chains that are constricting our economic ability to grow. It prevents us from growing, and that's true for us as a nation as well. The debts that we've incurred end up being a burden on us as we seek to pursue stewardship over God's creation. So let's summarize. The twin paths of welfarism and corporatism lead us away from the free market that produces prosperity. They're instead dark paths of interventionism that are going to push us deeper and deeper towards socialism. Where we are today with current levels of spending and taxation and borrowing, that's a direct result of the interventionist economy choking out economic prosperity, choking out good growth, choking out appropriate stewardship of God's creation. Remember that interventionism at the end of the day results in a form of slavery for those caught up inside that culture. Whether you're a slave because you're dependent upon the state for meeting your needs, or whether you're a slave because you're forced to work more, to produce more, to pay more, to finance those who are not working. In the end, we're all slaves under this system. What God calls us to is liberty under His law as we serve Him in the building of His kingdom in terms of stewardship.